The night did not begin with gunfire. It began with a feeling, the kind that crept along the spine and refused to be ignored. The jungle around the Marine position seemed too alive, too alert, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sweat clung to skin that had not been dry for days. Mosquitoes hummed in the darkness, indifferent to fear or war. Somewhere beyond the thin ribbon of the Tenaru River, unseen eyes watched 840 Marines who believed they were holding a quiet stretch of Guadalcanal. They were wrong, and deep down, many of them sensed it before the first shot was fired. Most of the men had arrived on the island expecting a short fight. The airfield behind them, barely carved out of the jungle, was the prize, and they assumed the Japanese would test it cautiously. Instead, the Marines found themselves isolated, undersupplied, and constantly exhausted. Food came irregularly. Ammunition was counted carefully. Malaria and dysentery weakened even the strongest bodies. Yet routine settled in, and routine bred a dangerous comfort. They dug shallow foxholes, strung barbed wire where they could, and posted sentries who stared into the dark until their eyes burned. Night after night passed with nothing more than distant noises and the constant buzz of insects. On this night, however, the darkness felt heavier. The river glimmered faintly under a thin moon, its banks choked with reeds and tangled roots. The Marines positioned near it whispered to each other, trying to shake the sense that they were being studied. Rifles were checked and rechecked. Fingers rested near triggers. A few men joked quietly, the humor thin and forced, the kind that existed only to keep fear at bay. Officers moved slowly along the line, speaking in low voices, reminding everyone to stay alert. No one knew that, across the river, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers were already in motion, advancing with absolute confidence that numbers and spirit would crush resistance. The Japanese attack plan was simple and ruthless. They believed the Marines were inexperienced, spread thin, and close to breaking. Their officers told them the Americans would flee at the first serious assault. Many of the Japanese soldiers had fought in China and carried themselves with the certainty of veterans. They moved through the jungle in tight formations, slipping between trees and through tall grass with practiced ease. Bayonets were fixed. Rifles were gripped firmly, orders were whispered, then passed hand to hand through the ranks. The men were prepared to die if necessary, convinced their sacrifice would clear the way to victory. The first sign of danger came not from gunfire but from sound. A sudden shout erupted near the riverbank, followed by the splash of bodies charging through shallow water. In an instant, the jungle exploded with noise. Flares shot into the sky, bathing the scene in harsh white light that revealed dozens, then hundreds of figures rushing forward. Machine guns opened up, their steady hammering tearing into the night. Tracers streaked across the river, cutting down attackers who kept moving, even as men around them fell. The Marines fired in disciplined bursts, training kicking in as fear surged through their bodies. The shock of the assault hit hard. Some Marines froze for a split second, stunned by the sheer number of enemy soldiers pouring out of the darkness. Then instinct took over. Shouts rang out as NCOs barked orders, directing fire, calling for more ammunition, repositioning men whose fields of fire were blocked. Rifles cracked rhythmically. Grenades arced into clusters of movement and detonated with concussive force, sending dirt and fragments into the air. The river became a killing ground, bodies piling up along its banks, yet the Japanese continued forward, driven by orders and belief. As the minutes dragged on, the Marines realized this was no probing attack. This was an attempt to annihilate them. Japanese soldiers reached the barbed wire, cutting through it under fire, some crawling over fallen comrades to get closer. In several places, the lines blurred into brutal, chaotic fighting at close range. Bayonets flashed, rifle butts swung, men grappled in the mud, slipping and cursing, the smell of blood mixing with wet earth and cordite. Fear was everywhere, but it did not paralyze. It sharpened the senses, narrowed focus to survival and the man next to you. One Marine, his hands shaking uncontrollably, reloaded his rifle again and again, barely aware of the bodies falling in front of him. Another man beside him had already been hit, slumped against the dirt, still trying to fire until a second round silenced him. There was no time to stop, no time to think. Every second mattered. Machine gun crews worked until their barrels glowed, swapping weapons when one overheated, dragging ammunition boxes through the mud with raw determination. Medics crawled forward under fire, pulling wounded men back, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, always risking everything. The Japanese attacks came in waves, each one screaming into the Marine positions with ferocity meant to overwhelm. Officers ran forward, waving swords, urging their men on. Bugles sounded briefly before being swallowed by gunfire. The Marines learned quickly to aim low, to conserve ammunition, to trust the discipline drilled into them during endless training back home. They were tired beyond anything they had known, but adrenaline kept them moving. The idea of retreat barely crossed their minds. Behind them was the airfield, the reason they were here, the reason they could not fail. Hours passed in a blur of noise and flashes of light. Time lost meaning. The jungle that had seemed so alive earlier was now torn apart, branches shattered, trees scarred by bullets. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging eyes and lungs. Somewhere in the chaos, radios crackled with fragmented messages, reports of enemy. Breakthroughs that were quickly countered, of ammunition shortages that somehow never became fatal. Leadership mattered now more than ever, and small unit leaders stepped up, making decisions that kept the line intact by inches. As the night wore on, the Japanese assaults began to lose coordination. The Marines sensed it before they saw it. Attacks became less focused, more desperate. Individual soldiers charged alone or in small groups, no longer supported by massed formations. Still, they came, driven by duty and desperation. The Marines continued to fire, hands blistered, shoulders aching, ears ringing. Some men laughed hysterically between bursts, a release of tension that bordered on madness. Others went quiet, faces set in grim concentration. Near dawn, the attacks finally began to fade. The firing slowed, then stopped in sections, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by groans and the crackle of small fires. The Marines remained in their positions, weapons trained forward, unwilling to believe it was over. When the sky began to lighten, revealing the full extent of the battlefield, the reality hit them with crushing weight. Bodies lay everywhere, tangled in wire, floating in the river, sprawled across open ground. The scale of the attack became clear, and with it the understanding of how close they had come to being overwhelmed. Exhausted, Marines slumped against their foxholes, too drained to speak. Some stared blankly ahead. Others checked their weapons mechanically, still expecting another wave. Officers moved among them, counting heads, offering quiet words of encouragement. The cost had been high, but the line had held. 840 Marines had faced an enemy more than 3 times their number and survived the night. None of them knew what the next night would bring, only that the illusion of safety was gone forever. Guadalcanal had revealed its true nature, and the Marines understood that from this moment on, survival would depend not on numbers but on resolve, discipline, and the refusal to yield, no matter how dark the night became. Dawn did not bring relief, only clarity. As the light crept over the shattered jungle, the Marines saw what the night had hidden from them, the sheer scale of what they had survived. Bodies lay everywhere, tangled in wire, slumped against riverbanks, half submerged in muddy water. The smell was overwhelming, a heavy mix of blood, smoke, and rotting vegetation that clung to the throat. Men stared silently, gripping rifles with hands that would not stop trembling. Some whispered prayers. Others said nothing at all, afraid that speaking might break whatever fragile control they still possessed. There was no time to rest. Officers moved quickly along the line, checking positions, redistributing ammunition, pulling exhausted men back only long enough to replace them with others who were just as worn. Wounded Marines were dragged to makeshift aid stations where medics worked with sleeves rolled up, faces streaked with sweat and grime. Morphine was rationed, bandages ran low. Men bit down on leather straps or clenched their jaws as shrapnel was pulled free. No one complained. Pain felt distant compared to the memory of the night. The silence was unsettling. After hours of constant gunfire, the quiet felt unnatural, as if the jungle itself were watching again. Marines expected another attack at any moment. Every snapped twig drew raised rifles. Every movement across the river set nerves on edge. The Japanese, however, had withdrawn to regroup, stunned by the resistance they had encountered. Their confidence had been shaken, but not broken. Orders were being issued. Plans revised, wounded dragged back through the undergrowth. The belief remained that the Marines could still be crushed with one overwhelming blow. Throughout the day, the Marines worked feverishly. They deepened foxholes, reinforced positions, and adjusted fields of fire based on where the attacks had been heaviest. Machine guns were repositioned to cover likely approaches. Ammunition was stacked where it could be reached quickly in the dark. Runners carried messages back and forth, feet blistered, faces drawn. Hunger gnawed at empty stomachs, but eating was secondary to preparation. Everyone understood that night would come again, and with it the enemy. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Sweat-soaked uniforms already stiff with dried mud and blood. Flies gathered thickly over the dead, forcing Marines to cover their mouths and noses. Burial details worked as fast as they could, dragging bodies away from the line, both American and Japanese, but there were too many. The dead Japanese were left where they fell, a grim reminder of what had happened and what might come again. No one spoke of mercy. War had stripped that word of meaning. By late afternoon, exhaustion pressed down like a physical weight. Some Marines nodded off, sitting upright, only to jerk awake moments later, heart pounding. Officers allowed short rotations, but no one was truly rested. The sense of anticipation was relentless. Men cleaned their weapons again, checking springs and bolts with obsessive care. Letters were pulled from pockets and read one last time, then folded and tucked away. A few Marines wrote quick notes on scraps of paper, messages meant for families who might never receive them. As dusk approached, the jungle darkened rapidly. Shadows lengthened, swallowing the ground where so many had fallen. The Marines took their positions once more, muscles tight, eyes straining into the gloom. Orders were whispered down the line. Hold fire until targets were clear. Conserve ammunition. Trust the men beside you. Somewhere across the river, Japanese officers were delivering their own order, urging their soldiers to redeem the honor lost the previous night. The second assault would be even more determined. The attack began suddenly, without warning, as if the darkness itself had erupted. Gunfire flared along the line, muzzle flashes lighting up faces twisted with effort, fear. The Japanese came again in large numbers, charging through the same killing grounds that had consumed so many hours earlier. This time, they attacked from multiple directions, probing for weaknesses, attempting to stretch the Marine defenses thin. Mortar rounds exploded behind the lines, sending dirt and fragments raining down on men who flattened themselves against the ground. The Marines responded with grim efficiency. Lessons learned the night before were applied instantly. Fire was disciplined, concentrated, devastating. Machine guns raked advancing formations, forcing attackers to scatter and crawl. Riflemen picked targets carefully, ignoring screams and focusing on movement. Grenades were tossed into shells where shapes clustered. Communication was constant, shouted orders passing from man to man, sometimes drowned out by explosions but always repeated until understood. At several points, Japanese soldiers managed to get dangerously close. In the confusion, small groups slipped through gaps, appearing suddenly in the darkness. Close quarters fighting erupted again, brutal and personal. Men fought with knives, bayonets, fists, anything at hand. The line bent but did not break. Marines who had never faced an enemy at arm's length before now did so with cold determination, driven by the knowledge that hesitation meant death. Hours crawled by. The night seemed endless, thicker and more oppressive than the first. Fatigue gnawed at every movement. Arms felt heavy, eyes burned, yet somehow the Marines continued to function, each man relying on muscle memory and trust. When ammunition ran low in one position, it was passed from another. When a machine gun crew was hit, nearby Marines stepped in without waiting for orders. Leadership emerged not from rank alone, but from action. The Japanese attacks grew increasingly desperate. Charges lost coordination, breaking apart under sustained fire. Officers fell in without them. Groups stalled or surged forward blindly. Still, individual soldiers pressed on, crawling toward Marine positions with grenades clutched in their hands, determined to take someone with them. The Marines learned to recognize the signs, to shoot quickly, to deny the enemy even that final act. By the early hours before dawn, the rhythm of battle began to slow. Gunfire became sporadic, then clustered in isolated pockets. The Marines sensed the shift, though they dared not relax. Every man remained alert, weapon trained forward, waiting for another wave that never fully materialized. The jungle echoed with distant shouts and occasional shots, but the massed assaults had stopped. When the sky finally lightened for the second time, the Marines were barely standing. Some leaned on their rifles to stay upright. Others sank into the mud where they stood, too exhausted to move. The battlefield looked even worse than before. Bodies lay piled where attacks had stalled, evidence of the futility of the repeated charges. The river was choked with debris and the dead. Smoke drifted lazily upward, blending with the morning mist. Slowly, the realization spread they had held again. Against overwhelming numbers, against exhaustion and fear, the line had not collapsed. 840 Marines still controlled the ground. The Japanese had thrown everything they had into those 2 nights and failed. The cost had been horrific, but the defense had succeeded. Men looked at one another with hollow eyes, sharing a bond forged in terror and survival that words could not capture. As officers began to take stock, counting survivors and assessing damage, a quiet pride settled over the line. It was not celebration. There was no cheering. Too many friends were missing for that. But there was understanding. They had faced the worst and endured. The myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked here, along this river, under the unrelenting fire of men who refused to yield. The Marines did not yet know how significant their stand would become. They did not think in terms of history or strategy. All they knew was that they were alive, that they had done their duty, and that for now the jungle was silent. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating exhausted faces and battered positions, the men of the line understood that something had changed. The enemy had learned they could be stopped, and the Marines had learned they could stop them, no matter the cost. Morning arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon what the jungle had become. Light crept across the battered Marine positions, revealing men who no longer resembled the soldiers who had landed on Guadalcanal weeks earlier. Faces were hollow, eyes red and swollen from smoke and sleeplessness. Uniforms were stiff with mud, sweat and blood. Rifles were gripped like lifelines. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence after 2 nights of unrelenting violence felt fragile, as though a single sound might summon the enemy back from the trees. The Japanese were gone, not entirely destroyed, not completely broken, but withdrawn. Their dead lay scattered across the battlefield in numbers that were difficult to comprehend. Bodies rested where they had fallen, some frozen mid-charge, others slumped quietly against riverbanks or tangled in the remains of barbed wire. The Marines looked out over the ground they had held and struggled to process the reality that they were still standing. Many had expected to die during the night. Some had quietly accepted it. Now survival felt strange, almost undeserved. Officers moved carefully among the men, taking stock, offering water where it could be spared, speaking in low voices that carried respect rather than command. Roll calls were conducted, names spoken aloud and answered with hoarse replies or painful silence. When a name went unanswered, no one asked questions. Everyone understood. Medics continued their work, tending to wounds that had been ignored in the heat of battle. Bandages were soaked through almost immediately. Morphine was scarce, and many Marines refused it anyway, saving it for those worse off. As the hours passed, the reality of what had been accomplished slowly began to sink in. 840 Marines had faced nearly 3,000 attackers and held their ground for 2 nights. The Japanese had believed their numbers, discipline, and willingness to die would guarantee victory. Instead, they had been stopped cold. Word spread quietly along the line, not as boasting but as disbelief. Men shook their heads, replaying moments in their minds when everything should have collapsed, but somehow did not. The airfield behind them remained secure. Aircraft still sat on its rough surface, battered but operational. Supplies could still land. The thin foothold the Americans had carved into Guadalcanal remained intact. That fact alone gave meaning to every desperate shot fired in the dark, every life lost in the mud. The Marines understood now that this place, this miserable strip of jungle and dirt, mattered far beyond their own survival. It was a line the enemy could not cross. Japanese forces regrouped deeper in the jungle, their confidence shaken. Officers struggled to explain how such a small force had repelled repeated assaults. The belief that American soldiers lacked discipline or courage had been shattered. Survivors of the attack spoke in hushed tones about machine guns that never seemed to stop firing, about Marines who stood their ground even when surrounded, about a defense that did not break no matter how many times it was struck. Fear, once dismissed, began to take root. For the Marines, there was no triumph, only exhaustion and resolve. They buried their dead as best they could, marking graves with simple wooden crosses or rifle stocks. There were no speeches, no ceremonies. Each burial was brief, personal, and heavy with grief. Friends stood silently, staring at the ground, committing faces and voices to memory. War moved too fast for mourning, but loss lingered all the same. As days followed, the battle became a reference point, a dividing line between before and after. New Marines arriving on Guadalcanal heard stories about the river and the nights when the jungle burned. Veterans spoke quietly, never exaggerating, never glorifying. They talked about fear, about confusion, about holding on when everything screamed to run. Those stories carried weight, shaping how others prepared, how they fought, how they understood the enemy. The Japanese would attack again on Guadalcanal many times, with artillery, air raids, and fresh troops. The campaign would drag on for months, grinding both sides down in a war of endurance. But something fundamental had shifted during those 2 nights. The Japanese advance had been checked. The momentum they had carried across the Pacific was no longer unstoppable. Guadalcanal became the place where that truth was proven in blood. For the Marines who had held the line, the memory never faded. Long after the guns fell silent, they would remember the sound of footsteps in the dark, the sudden glare of flares, the way fear felt like a living thing pressing against the chest. They would remember comrades who did not rise with the dawn, men who had shared foxholes, jokes, and last cigarettes. Survival came with a cost that could not be measured in numbers alone. Years later, historians would analyze the battle, count casualties, debate tactics, and label it a turning point. They would speak of strategies, supply lines, and command decisions. But none of that fully captured what happened along that river. What mattered most were ordinary men, exhausted and outnumbered, who refused to give ground because giving ground meant everything was lost. Their stand was not about glory, it was about duty, loyalty, and the simple decision to hold on for one more minute, then another. As the Pacific War continued, the reputation of American Marines grew. Stories of Guadalcanal spread through the ranks, strengthening resolve in battles yet to come. The knowledge that the enemy could be stopped, even under the worst conditions, became a quiet source of confidence. It did not eliminate fear, but it gave it context. Fear could be endured. Fear could be mastered. The jungle eventually reclaimed the battlefield. Rain washed away bloodstains. Vegetation grew over shattered trees and shallow graves. The river flowed on, indifferent to what had occurred along its banks. But the legacy of those 2 nights endured, carried by the men who survived and by the history they shaped. Guadalcanal was no longer just a name on a map. It was proof that resolve could overcome numbers, that discipline could withstand terror, and that even in the darkest hours, a determined few could change the course of a war. And so the story ended not with celebration, but with understanding. 840 Marines had stood against 3,000 and held. They had done what seemed impossible because failure was not an option. In the silence that followed the battle, as the jungle breathed once more, their stand echoed far beyond those shattered riverbanks, marking the moment when the tide of the Pacific began, slowly but surely, to turn.